Sorry?
Yeah, of course, that light just.
This one.
Yeah.
Need to do is to,
Can the light outside go off as well? Because it's.
That's on a sensor, so it will go off eventually.
Because it's
Fantastic. So, if you close this door, it might go in the lamp off faster.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to St Marylebone, and welcome to the last lecture in our spring series. This lecture is Adapting Church Architecture for the Modern Landscape. This evening we have Dr. Kate Jordan from the University of Westminster, who will be talking about the history of how churches have adapted their architecture over time. And we also have Mark Hammond from Caroe Architecture, who will talk more specifically about how St Marylebone has undergone some recent renovations. Yes, so I'm doing this thing now. Putting this here, that's all right. I'll take that. Yeah. So,
just retreat my hearing aids.
click that.
Am I coming out through that microphone?
yes.
Yeah, good, excellent. So, let me just check that this clicks through. Yes, it does. Thanks everybody for coming to this last lecture, and it's a real privilege, and I'm very grateful to be invited. It's a real privilege to be giving a discussion alongside Mark about this question of adapting churches. I'll be very interested to hear what Mark has to say specifically about his work in this church. So for my part of this talk, I'd like to look at the ways in which church buildings are, and I think always have been, in dialogue with social and theological shifts. And the practice of adapting them, I'm going to be thinking about how this meets new needs and how these buildings, or changing the way that these buildings work, is absolutely fundamental to their character as living, functioning spaces. I think we would all agree that that's what churches do. That's how we think of them. I'll be focusing on Anglican churches in London, and I think it's really important to specify that because I can't talk about what all denominations do. Indeed, I can't talk about what all churches do in the Anglican communion, and nor can I talk about what happens outside London, because obviously what we say about London can't be said about the rest of the country. So I'll be looking really at Anglican churches in London. So with that caveat, I want to address two strands of church adaptations in this talk. Firstly, I'm going to be looking at the multi-purpose nature of churches, as I said, which is far from a new phenomenon. And secondly, I'd like to look a little bit at the impact that conservation practice and philosophy, and I'm sure Mark will pick up on this, has had on the fabric of churches and how they've been adapted and reused and used. And I'd like to finish by suggesting that the status of church refurbishment and adaptation as a branch of architectural practice is something that's really grown over the 21st century. With schemes now within numerous national awards. So this is something that I'm going to suggest is a burgeoning field of architectural practice. But to give some context, I'll start with a short history of the way the churches have been used across time. So a short history, a big history, thinking about these as multifunctional spaces, as I said. And then I'll look in more detail at two examples of London churches that have recently been and are in the process of being refurbished and remodeled. So just before I start, for full disclosure, this is not in London. This building is St Columba in Southwick in Sunderland, and it's actually an unexecuted plan. So I just wanted to get some imaging here because I know it. So it's sort of not really relevant, but it's from a fantastic PhD by an architectural historian called Matthew Steele. So look out for that. It's a PhD. So, first of all, let's just think about what churches are for and how this has changed or not over the years. We all accept that now, I think, churches tend to be more than just places of worship. They're spaces that facilitate different uses and different activities. But we often have a sense that in the past, churches were solely places of worship. That's not quite accurate. And in fact, going all the way back to early Christianity, we can see that actually churches have always been both sacred and secular spaces, or this is not a new phenomenon. And here we've got St Priscilla catacombs from around the 3rd or 4th century. I'm sure my sister will correct me if I'm wrong about that. And the Europos house church in Syria. So you can see that these are buildings which are sort of merged sacred and secular. By the time we get to the medieval era, churches were not only where baptisms, marriages, funerals and so on took place, but they were also sites where communities gathered for social gatherings connected to Christian festivals, and taking that even further, some scholars have suggested that they actually functioned as the community village hall. So the theologian John Gordon Davis takes this idea of the church being the village hall a step further, suggesting that, as you can see, there can be no question that in the Middle Ages, the church was an all-purpose building. It is difficult to think of any secular activity that has no connection with it. I should say that that's a slightly disputed point, so particularly the archaeologist Richard Halsey suggests that Davis is probably overstating that. I think he probably is. The idea that any secular activity took place in a medieval church seems quite unlikely to me. Nevertheless, it's clear that churches were more than simply just places of worship, and that they in fact served a much wider purpose in bringing the community together. So, by the 18th century, non-conformists began to completely rethink the idea of the church. Forgive me, I'm just going to go off on a little bit of a tangent here and not talk about Anglican churches. I'm just going to briefly think about Methodists because they're relevant, particularly because of the connections, I guess, here to Charles Wesley. So Methodists and non-conformists often met in private houses or secular public buildings, and the idea of a consecrated place of worship really held very little value. Indeed, God was found wherever the faithful met. The churches were only considered holy when people were gathered within them to worship. For non-conformists, that division between sacred and secular had really started to dissolve. And indeed, the former Cannon Foundry, where John Wesley established his London headquarters, served simultaneously as a church, his own apartment and study, a school, residence for itinerant preachers, and stables. It wasn't until 1778, nearly 40 years after he established the foundry, that Wesley commissioned a purpose-built chapel in London, although obviously Methodist chapels were being built elsewhere, but this really gives you a sense of the fact that this notion of the church being a sacred space was really starting to change in the 18th century. And it wasn't just Methodists who were changing the face of British church architecture. The Church of England, the emergence of the Low Church began to influence the style of churches, and the growing population of Britain's burgeoning cities saw a sharp rise in the number of churches being built. After the Napoleonic Wars, a large number of churches were built in response to the 1818 Building Act. You can see examples here, St John's, Waterloo, which you may know, and John's Holy Trinity, Marylebone, which is not far from here. And these were known as commissioners' churches. They were part of the raft of churches that were built in the early 19th century following the Churches Building Act, of which this church, though not being a commissioner's church, belongs at least in style to the raft of new churches that we built. So in the low and broad church, this idea of sacred space had lost its significance, the significance that it had in pre-Reformation churches, and indeed carried on having in the Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches. So having just deviated somewhat from the subject of my talk, private purpose-built churches, I'd now like to turn our attention to the Victorians, because it was during the 19th century that adaptations of historic churches, largely as a result of shifts in Anglican theology, really took off on a large scale. And in doing so, it established new ways, not necessarily directly or deliberately, new ways of approaching conservation. As I'm sure most of you know, around about 80% of churches were remodeled during the 19th century, which prompted a very serious review of conservation practice. And here we have a perfect example of Charles Henry Scott's controversial St Albans Cathedral, which he changed quite radically. And I'll come back to George Gilbert Scott in a moment, but this gives you an idea of the kind of thing that was happening in the 19th century, kind of problems or I don't know, positive or negative things that were happening with churches during the 19th century. So the reason this was all happening was that from the early 1840s, the growing prevalence of the Gothic style in the Anglican Church coincided with a schism, a theological schism, which saw the establishment of the Tractarian faction, so Anglo-Catholicism, which reinstated pre-Reformation rites, by which I mean largely the transubstantiation, so the use of consecrated hosts being basically the literal body of Christ, a shift in theology. And this reintroduced the notion of sacredness in the architecture of the church. So we've just been looking at these low church buildings, which are much more closely connected to Protestantism. What the Tractarians wanted to do was reintroduce this notion of the Gothic, pre-Reformation, so Anglo-Catholic in terms of the way the liturgy functioned. For them, the only way that this kind of mass could take place was in a medieval style church. Only those kind of churches could facilitate that kind of worship. So in 1839, the Cambridge Camden Society was founded to advance the study of medieval church architecture and to promote church restorations. For the founding members, John Mason Neal, Benjamin Webb, and Alexander Beresford Hope, the dual causes of Gothic architecture and Tractarian ideology were indivisible. Alexander Beresford Hope personally invested large sums in promoting the new style, most notably paying for the Society's model church, All Saints Margaret Street, which you can see on the left there, which was designed in 1850 by William Butterfield. Other wealthy Anglo-Catholic philanthropists followed suit, with the banker Henry Mildmay, for example, commissioning the Anglo-Catholic architect J.D. Sedding to restore a number of churches across southwest England between the 1860s and 1880s. The approaches favoured by the Cambridge Camden Society accepted the restoration principles set out by the French architect Eugène-Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc, which are summed up, his principles are summed up in his conviction that, to quote him, to restore a building is not to preserve it, to repair it or rebuild it, it's to reinstate it in a condition of completeness which could never have existed at any time. And that's really what's going on to a large extent with the restoration of churches like All Saints Holderton here by J.D. Sedding, restored by J.D. Sedding. Although some would argue that Sedding was not as destructive a restorer as George Gilbert Scott. So this idea of creative restoration met with nothing less than absolute fury in some quarters and prompted the foundation of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings. And indeed, it was specifically George Gilbert Scott, who was highly influenced by Viollet-le-Duc, so really took this idea of restoration, creative restoration, and used it in his own work. Tewkesbury Abbey, St Albans being good examples. So it was specifically Tewkesbury and Scott's plans for a heavy-handed restoration of the Abbey that were the catalyst for the foundation of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, SPAB. And you can see from the account which is on here of William Morris's reaction to the news about Tewkesbury that he really wasn't very happy about it at all. My eye has just caught the word restoration in the morning paper, and on looking closer I saw that this time it's nothing less than the Minster of Tewkesbury that is to be destroyed by St Gilbert Scott. Is it altogether too late to do something to save it? And whatever else beautiful and historical is still left to us on the sites of the ancient buildings that were once so famous for. William Morris and Philip Webb's impassioned SPAB manifesto, which became the cornerstone of modern philosophy, conservation philosophy, was very clear about the deference that architects should have for historic buildings. And I'm going to read a section of it because it's very relevant to what's coming, and it will of course be very relevant to Mark's talk. So the SPAB manifesto, it is for all these buildings, therefore, of all times and styles, that we plead and call upon those who have to deal with them to put protection in the place of restoration to stave off decay by daily care, to prop a perilous wall or mend a leaky roof by such means as are obviously meant for support of covering, and show no pretence of other art, and otherwise to, and this is the most important bit, resist all tampering with either the fabric or ornament of the building as it stands. To be clear, Morris and Webb weren't opposed to adapting buildings. What they were really bothered about was restoring, removing the layers of history. That's what was really bothered. Any adaptations had to be readable, so that it was clear that the building was being added to rather than being returned to idealised moment in history or some conjectural moment in history. Thinking again of Viollet-le-Duc, think about Notre Dame, in which Viollet-le-Duc restored it to what he thought Notre Dame should look like, not what it actually looked like at any point. So this idea of creative restoration was what Morris and Webb were really kicking against. The SPAD principles gained ground over the 20th century with the effect that church restoration as a high-status branch of architectural practice slowly diminished over the 20th century. Perhaps because the moral injunction against all tampering with either the fabric or ornament of the building as it stands severely limited the scope for individual creativity. As a result, the significance of this practice in 19th century architecture is sometimes overlooked by architectural historians. Not only did the most celebrated Victorian architects, such as George Gilbert Scott, G. Street, make a living out of church restorations, but they also, this is something that's very often forgotten, received wide acclaim for this during their lifetime. This was not considered by the, in the consensus of architectural criticism to be a bad thing. And a mark of this historiographical shift is that J.D. Zedding is better known today for his original churches, such as Holy Trinity, Sloane Square, and his contribution to the arts and crafts movement than he is for his extensive church restorations, which won much admiration in his time. So we don't tend to think about those church restorations as being significant contributions to architecture. This is not to say that church refurbishment and adaptation wasn't taking place during the 20th century just because it was sort of falling out of fashion a little bit as a practice. It was certainly happening and often in quite radical ways. In particular, the post-war era saw large numbers of bomb-damaged churches rebuilt and repaired in a range of different ways. Some taking creative license, significant creative license. Here, for example, is Stephen Dykesbauer's refurbishment of St Verdast in the city, the Equestrian Road St Verdast, bomb damage, and you can see that he's introduced, he did this in the rebuild of it took place between the 1950s and 1960s. This interior was remodeled in 1962 using the rather incongruous collegiate chapel style. Not, I hasten to add, an ignorance, but this was a kind of idiosyncratic intervention. In addition to the impact of the Blitz, the decrees of the Second Vatican Council between 1963 and 1965 instituted changes to the liturgy in the Roman Catholic Church, such as Mass delivered with the priest facing the congregation, which required repositioning of altars. Just for those people who don't know much and why should you have the Second Vatican Council, this was a convening of cardinals and advisors and so on in the early 60s, with the attempt of completely modernising Catholic worship. And then that in itself had an impact on Catholic architectural art, most notably having to reconfigure internal spaces so that the altar could be moved away from the east wall and the priest could stand in front of it, delivering the Mass in English or vernacular tongue to the congregation. So that required a very significant reordering and modernisation of Catholic churches, which then had the effect of feeding out into the rest of church architecture across different denominations, like Anglicanism and Nonconformism, which sort of took on this modernising impulse and took that forward. It should be noted, though, that during the 1960s and 1970s, this largely affected purpose-built churches, and most churches were actually invested in building new churches rather than adapting existing ones, and also notably functioning on building dual-purpose churches as well. So that was a big thing that was happening in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. However, extensive remodelling started up again in the 1980s when congregations began to dwindle and funds became scarcer and community facilities were starting to become incorporated into the churches. There was much more space inside the churches because people didn't need that as much anymore, so you could bring the community facilities inside the church. In such cases, and I should say that's not a uniform, that didn't happen uniformly, but there was a much bigger emphasis on that. Here, the emphasis was less on expensive or creative restorations to the original church, but much more about adapting the church to changing needs. So, this brings us up to the present day. How are churches meeting our needs today, and what implications does this have for the fabric and function of historic buildings? I think we have to consider two things here. Firstly, how worship has changed and what demands now need to be met. And secondly, that churches are increasingly and rightly using their buildings to make some money and keep themselves afloat. See, restorations and adaptations and so on cost money, they have to find this. So, I'm going to look at two examples from London that I've written about recently that shed some light on these issues. The first is St John at Hackney, which is a church with a healthy and indeed growing congregation, where the church has been used to generate an income. It's part of the Holy Trinity Voluntary group, so it's got an expanding congregation. And the second is St Anselm's in Kennington, which, in contrast, is a church with a shrinking congregation, where the large internal space is being imaginatively remodeled in ways, I should say, that are highly unorthodox, which I'll come to later, to reduce the nave and create more community space. So let's start with St John at Hackney. The £6 million refurbishment of this Grade 2-star listed church, which was completed in 2020, illustrates, among other things, the way in which enabling development, that is to say, selling land for housing, selling land which is adjacent to an existing church for housing, and therefore unlocking quite a lot of money to pay for things like refurbishments of churches. How this has become an established business model that can unlock a lot of funds in London where land value is high. Initially, a heritage lottery grant was secured to carry out much needed repairs to the historic fabric of the church, and the parish engaged the practice Thomas Ford and Partners TFP. This was necessary not only to protect the building, but also to enhance its existing profile as a concert venue. And the importance of this is that St John at Hackney, the church, the actual building, generated a lot of income because it's a high-profile music venue. Lots of major artists performed there. The TFP scheme allocated most of the budget on work to repair the building and rationalise the layout. There were some quite serious repairs that needed to be done, which obviously were very costly. It's a Grade 2-star listed building. The interior of the church, built in 1794 by James Spiller, had been remodelled in the 1950s. See if I can picture that. By the noted church architect N.F. Cashmel-Day, important inter- and post-war Anglican architect, to include sort of Festival of Britain style fittings and the incorporation of community space within the church. The TFP scheme retained the community facilities within the main body of the church, partly because of the cost and practical limitations of relocating these. So obviously to remove the community facilities and build something new would have been very costly. That was all the HLF grant paid for. However, a deal was done with a company called Thornset, which unlocked, through the enabling development, a lot more money, and that gave the parish a lot more opportunity, a lot more possibilities that they could explore. In 2017, the Reverend Al Gordon, who's a clergyman, as I said, for the HTB network, arrived at the church and brought with him a very lively, charismatic tradition and an ambitious vision. So Gordon approached the internationally acclaimed architect John Pawson to work with TFP on what was to be Pawson's first church project in the UK. John Pawson, who is a very high-profile architect and international architect with lots of buildings, lots of very white Viennese buildings across the world, so presumably they knew what they were getting. Engaging Pawson had the dual benefit of putting St John at Hackney on the architectural map. The schemes had very wide coverage in the architectural press, indeed I've written about it myself, for RIBA. And modernising the space for the vibrant performative worship that characterises HTB churches. So just to link this to changes, shifts in worship practices, Holy Trinity Brompton belongs to the evangelical tradition, and it's very musical, very young, lots of you need big stages, big PA systems, and so on and so forth. This really does reflect a very significant change in congregation, different demographic, different form of worship. So the revised Pawson TFP scheme saw the community facilities removed from the church and incorporated into the new residential development, which is called Hackney Gardens. So they had money to take out the community facilities, open the church up, rebuild purpose-built community facilities off-site. This arrangement had the advantage from the point of view of the client and the architect that the internal space, so from an aesthetic point of view, the internal space could be opened up and James Miller's original Greek cross plan be reinstated. There you can see. The completed interior is voluminous, light, sparse, features a large state-of-the-art PA system, and it also features a bar, which you can see on the right there, it's a purpose-built bar for serving drinks for the concert goers. And the significance of this site, as you can see from the picture, as a music venue is at least as important as its use as a church, because that's where all the money is generated. So it's a relationship that exists between a kind of business model and place of worship, which is very effective for the church. Pawson is noted, as I said, for his minimalist style, and the refurbishment is immediately reminiscent of his austere makeover of the Monatskirche in Augsburg, which, to use Pawson's words, comprised a meticulous paring away of selected elements of the church's complex fabric. At St John at Hackney, the project architect Stephen Dodd was keen to emphasise that the scheme does not simply roll out Pawson brand minimalism, but instead sought to reinstate the Georgian plan and spirit of the original church by removing subsequent alterations, the Cache-Mosaic alterations. When I last looked at this, wasn't quite complete. It may have been completed now. At that time, almost completed scheme at St John at Hackney has been widely praised for its sophisticated and sensitive aesthetic. But the complete removal of the Cache-Mosaic fittings, a decorative scheme, is perhaps debatable the extent to which that was necessary to completely remove it, to completely remove that layer of history. We could debate that forever. And it went through without any objection from any of the heritage bodies, including the statutory consultee 20th Century Society. Here, the opportunity to reinstate the original plan and Georgian Low Church spirit has justified this shift away from orthodox conservation approaches, which tend to retain some evidence of successful alteration. So what we can see here is this real paring away, to use Pawson's own phrase, of the different layers, the 1950s layers, particularly of the church. This refurbishment also highlights new economic and business models and the benefit of headline-grabbing church refurbishments. However, it would be remiss if we not point out the vital repairs to the roof, which were factored into the initial budget, remained, at least they did last time I looked, remained to be done in 2021, they might have been finished now. And the church was still seeking funds through the old time-honoured route of congregational tithes to pay for this. Perhaps it's been completed. So in contrast to St John at Hackney, my next example has had to respond, as I said, to a shrinking congregation and think about how it can reconfigure space which is now too large for worship. Here are interior and exterior renders of a scheme for the Grade 2 listed at St Anselm's, Kennington, which have been drawn up by Dow Jones Architects and will feature a radical reconfiguration of the liturgical arrangement, allowing for more community space. As with St John at Hackney, this will be funded through enabling development, with adjacent land being sold for housing. What's unusual about this scheme is that the new design draws inspiration from the earliest plans for St Anselm, produced in 1912 by the practice Adshead and Ramsey. The picture you can see on the right is the 1912 plan for St Anselm, and it was unexecuted. The reason it's unusual is because it's this ghost plan. It's this plan of the building that was never actually never materialised, that's formed the inspiration for the new refurbishment of this building. So this ghostly plan was for a centralised Latin cross church with a dome, as you can see here. Though the foundation stone was laid in 1914 and work began on the construction of the walls, it was halted during the First World War and was then completely redesigned, presumably because this was much cheaper, in an early Christian style with a basilican plan. That was completed in 1933. The current scheme, which reduces the existing nave and chancel by a third to create 4 levels of new space, proposes a novel liturgical arrangement, and it's quite difficult to see from the plans there, but I will explain it. What will happen is that double doors at the ground floor will replace the rear doors. Let me just flip to that. So behind the baldaquino there'll be doors, which you can see there. And that will open up dead space behind these four. And allow, so basically you'll have a retro choir during services if you need to have one, and you'll have that space when the doors are closed, that space behind can be used for community purposes. Some of the fittings and artwork will be retained in the refurbishment. They're not necessarily in the same place. The baldaquino, for example, at one point the plan was for the baldaquino to be moved outside as a sort of installation, external installation. Some things are going to be lost. The removal of these large murals by the Royal Academician Norman Adams, which were commissioned for the church in 1971, won't be able to stay because the internal space will be reconfigured such that there won't be room for those murals even there. And they're quite significant murals. These are from an article that was written in the Journal Art of Christianity. So that will be a loss. The church, which belongs to the liberal Anglican tradition, has a socially mixed congregation and actively promotes inclusion and diversity. Though the culture of liberal Anglicanism is socially progressive, the style of worship is more traditional in the charismatic way, that is to say, Holy Trinity Brompton and other churches like that. And it's not experiencing similar growth. Again, really importantly, the Church of England actually is growing, and Anglicanism is growing in London, partly because, or largely because of the evangelical. So unlike churches such as St John at Hackney, the community requires a space that has to adapt to shrinking numbers of worshippers. Despite this, however, St Anselm's has a growing range of outreach activities which the new scheme is designed to accommodate. So the significant thing here, I think, is that even though the number of worshippers, regular worshippers, is shrinking, actually the outreach and community activities that take place in St Anselm's are flourishing. And so this new adaptation of the church will allow that will really facilitate that. So though this scheme is highly unconventional, Dow Jones' track record has gained them the trust of the Southwark Diocesan Advisory Committee. Their work has gathered a series of prestigious awards for intelligent refurbishments of Hawks Moors, Christchurch Spitalfields, G Streets, St Magdalene, Paddington, as well as the acclaimed refurbishment of the Garden Museum in the former church of St Mary Lambeth. Both of the examples I've been discussing from award-winning architects demonstrate, I think, that the standard and status of refurbishment, church refurbishment and adaptations has really risen in recent years. In the two examples that I've highlighted, this is partly to do with more money being available for the schemes, but it's also evidence of parishes thinking creatively about the way these buildings can be used, not just as places of worship, but as sites that serve a whole range of functions, as churches always have. Functions that allow the church to raise money through business initiatives, such as doubling up as a concert venue, but also, perhaps more importantly, those that enable churches to fulfill their pastoral role in the wider community. And whether we're religious or not, I think this is something that we can all agree, to borrow from E.P. Thompson, is an unqualified human good. Thank you.
Good. Let's just we go. Bear with me a moment. So hopefully that comes out loud and clear. Right, well thank you Kate, that was really interesting and lots of parallels. We could probably go off the tangent on several points there, but it was good to see Dow Jones's recent work there. We've worked with them on St Marylebone, Paddington, and indeed at Christchurch Spitalfields as well, so it's a small world. So I think just introducing what I'm going to talk about, which is the Changing Lives project here, there are a number of threads to pick up on and say that actually what I'm going to be showing you is, I hope you'll find less of the big architect, big ego approach, sweeping away what's come before, but very much working with what the church offers and building upon the layers, being selective about those parts of the building and assigning a value to them, but actually aiming to add to it and to develop something stronger with greater purpose. So just to start off with, a little bit about me and my background. I'm a conservation architect. I'm a director of Caroe Architecture, and I have great pleasure of an office based in St Paul's Cathedral, where my business partner is the surveyor of the fabric. I'm surveyor to the University Church in Oxford and a number of Oxford colleges and their chapels, and also closer to home, the Apothecaries Hall, the City of London, and the Theatre Royal Haymarket. Not just churches and cathedrals, but work over the last 30 years or so. They've also included Stowe House in the middle, and the Sandy Offer wing at the National Maritime Museum, bottom right. Bottom left is St Ethelburga's Church in Bishopsgate, which has probably been my most radical transformation of an ecclesiastical building from a pile of rubble as it was left after the IRA Bishopsgate bomb in the 1990s, back into the building that exists today on Bishopsgate. So, back to this building, St Marylebone Parish Church. The long history. The first St Marylebone Church, as many of you will know, wasn't actually here. It was on a site nearer the West End. And in fact, the second church was actually next door to here on an adjacent site. But with John Nash laying out Regent's Park and creating some greater formality, a lot of interest was created about a new church at St Marylebone. And there was quite a bit of interest. Bottom right there is a scheme that Sir William Chambers produced in the early 19th century for the church. But in fact, the eventual designer was Thomas Hardwick, and he built the church over the period of 1813 to 1870. The central image there at the top is how the interior of the church used to exist, with tiered galleries, and I think that only lasted for around 60 years or so, because in fact the first of the adaptations and the development of the church then came along in the 1880s. So Thomas Harris was responsible for the first part of the evolving development of St Marylebone, removing the upper gallery and redecorating the church and representing the interior, including a new apse. So in fact, the left-hand drawing, the pink parts of the walls, are the parts that actually he rebuilt and redesigned in the late 19th century. The image on the right shows the scheme, we believe, as built, but I'll ask you to pay attention to the ceiling, because I'm going to come back to that a little later on. Because it revealed itself in the 21st century to be not all as it first appeared. So, as work progressed through the 20th century, there were a number of changes, some potential, some actual, including passing the responsibility of the church garden to Westminster, which is the drawing in the middle at the top. But just a word of caution there for anybody commissioning drawings for schemes. make sure you do check them, because actually when you look at the small print, it looks like the church actually gave away the building itself to Westminster and retained the garden for its own use. However, clearly they accepted that as an error because the church has continued to this day, but do check the small print. Some damage, although not too significant during the Second World War, and in the post-war scheme for the Browning Chapel, bottom and the middle, black and white, a Browning Chapel on the bottom left wasn't built, but there was a Browning Chapel built into the back of the nave. However, that eventually became completely divided off from the back of the nave. The 20th century tradition that Kate was talking about, creating more space for communities and meeting rooms, and that is the Browning Room as exists today, although that is one of the areas that we looked at in part of our recent scheme. The biggest change that happened in the 20th century to the church was in the 1980s, however, with clearance of the crypt, so the area that we're sitting in at the moment, and the adoption of a full mind, body and spirit approach to looking after the congregation that the church developed. So the crypt was cleared of burials, where we are today. The area to the east of the church, so down towards the bottom of that image, was excavated for a light well to allow windows to be inserted down the east side to bring light into the building. And then on the west side, a very large subterranean extension was added. And on the west side, actually, that was predominantly occupied by a new NHS doctor's surgery. And I'm not sure what the current role is on the surgery, but I think it's in 5 figures in terms of numbers of patients that served out of the doctor's surgery in this building. To the bottom right was a healing and counselling centre, and that also is just behind where Jess is sitting, those rooms behind, and that still exists today as well. So that was carried out in the 1980s. However, by the 21st century, there was quite a lot of other activity going on. So, yes, there was the very busy, very polluted Marylebone Road, but there was a lot of activity being offered to buildings nearby. So the Royal Academy of Music, who had a long-term lease, I just think they still have, for use of the organ. And to the south of the church is the Marylebone School, and that has existed and uses the school as an extension of its own facilities, and indeed it's where school assembly happens and other church activities. So it's very busy and vibrant use. However, by the 2010s, there were quite a collection of challenges that existed. The building had been used hard for many decades, and there was a growing list of repairs and conservation work needed to this Grade 1 listed building. The entry and arrival points of the building, particularly getting down to the crypt, were not easily navigable, nor feeling particularly welcoming. There were some accessibility improvements in the 1980s, but 20 to 30 years later, they were really beginning to feel fall short of what best practice was in terms of accessibility. And then once one adds the difficulties of satisfactory fire escapes, there were them, but they were awkward. The crypt hall here was poorly ventilated, and there was a lack of quality meeting rooms and facilities generally. The building services were at the end of their useful life, and there were a growing number of concerns about the roof, of the nave, and of the ceiling as well. And then the building was put on the at-risk register for Historic England, so one can begin to see that actually doing nothing was not an option. So without getting too complicated in delving into the plan and the arrangements, staying down here at the crypt, there was time to be spent in thinking about how the building could be reconfigured. This is how the building was, well, 5 years plus ago, if you come down here. Pink areas show that the GP surgery had in fact grown. So not only was it occupying the west side, but it was stretching over behind where you're sitting, and in fact across the other side of the central corridor that you all came down. So it was becoming a bit awkward in terms of managing it. The Healing and Counselling Centre, bottom left, took up a small amount of space, relatively speaking, but needed improvement in terms of some of their quality of spaces. But in fact, the church's own spaces for community use were somewhat squeezed to some of the blue areas, but many of those blue areas were in fact circulation. This area down here was actually how one accessed the whole of the crypt, brought people in here. There was a tiny lift, which was nearing the end of its useful life, and a very narrow staircase. So what the plan was to try and reconfigure some of those, but the driving factor was in fact how one gets good access down into the basement that's available for all of these various uses, that's easy to navigate, and actually works more equitably in terms of accessibility. And after much feasibility work and testing, the old stair access down was decided that we would abandon that, and the best place that we found for the new stair was adjacent. And that was actually an area that was occupied by the doctor's surgery, their meeting rooms and main reception. It was useful in that actually it did face directly onto the main access corridor. But then, of course, we were then into reconfiguring some of the spaces. So what ended up happening was that there was a bit of a land swap with the doctor's surgery. So the doctor's surgery were given space over here in the swap for this. There had been a very tired servery next to the plant room in the area under the steps, and that was to be reconfigured as a better quality of meeting room. The loos needed refurbishment, and in fact this crypt hall, it sort of occupied a space in the middle, but it was kind of space left over. And in fact, if anybody had come here up until about 5 years ago, this room was actually slightly longer, and there was a corridor cross route here, through which occasionally people used to have to navigate to get from one side of the building, even if there was a function going on at the time, so not entirely practical. So in fact, we've made this particular room slightly shorter in the interests of practicality. So just sort of taking you to the access. So top left there would have been how all of you would have got down into the crypt if you'd come here just a few short years ago. It was awkward, it was tight, it was not accessible, and I can remember on many an occasion, because the doctor's surgery, patients also used to come and go through there, that you'd get halfway down the stairs and then you'd have to turn around and back up. There's nodding heads there, remembering that, and a lot of very politeness and being very English about it, and everybody reversing back up. But it was clearly not something that was practical or necessarily particularly safe in the long term. So, designing the stair to be fitted in to the adjacent space, aimed to take a circular form and taking cues from some of the style of the vestibule staircases by the entrance, but without necessarily slavishly copying all of the detail. The vestibule stairs are traditional cantilevered stonework. These needed to be a somewhat lighter and more efficient structure, and therefore also more cost effective. That said, there was still an awful lot of structural work involved. So the corner of the building that stair that you probably all came down occupies used to have brick vaults like this in place. And there's quite a bit of structural gymnastics involved because they all lean on each other. If you're taking one of them out, creating a hole, you have to keep the others in place while you brace it and build a new stair and the reinforcement in place, and trying to do that elegantly and neatly at the same time. Top left is the new stair under construction. Although you may have thought you were walking down a timber stair, the structure underneath it is actually steel and it's clad in timber for its efficiency and strength, and that's what gives it its light feel and appearance. It's got a plaster underside, metal rod balusters that copy the style of the vestibule staircases with a hardwood handrail similar to the vestibules. So in fact, as you can see, this is the area that was cut through in order to drive the new staircase through the building. So that gave us the opportunity to use the spaces adjacent. So what we have done in the old lobby, so bottom left is before, and then the image on the right is the after, it's the same space. We've taken that over entirely, and that is the new kitchen for the church, but also the volunteers' room, and it's much more practical and appropriate for that, and it's a central and shared facility. And the doctor's surgery got a new reception, which was more easy to find because it was straight off the main corridor and accessible. Upstairs, there used to be a kitchen on the upper level. That was top left there, that image. That's actually the same window in both of those images there. We took out the kitchen and the lift shaft that used to occupy much of that space. And what you're now looking at from a similar vantage point is the top of the new stair, which connects directly through to the vestibule through a reopened and reused original doorway from the vestibule, and that's actually where the previous lift, in its tiny form, used to sit in front of. So in fact, that's a much more airy and open space, and hopefully you'll find is more welcoming as well. Also worth pausing to say that the monuments that exist around the vestibules and in this area have been cleaned and restored as part of the work, with the opportunity to incorporate a plaque recognising some of the contested heritage of some of these monuments. So that oval grey slate plaque there, do take a look at that on your way back out, because that is to recognise those who are not recognised in the other monuments around the church. Taking the story of how one gets in and out of the crypt a little bit further, looking at the vestibules themselves, these areas have now been improved, and they were a somewhat untidy and drafty area, and these now have weather lobbies across the door. They do work reasonably well, I think, in stopping that very piercing north wind that used to blow through the church whenever it blew from that direction, and actually makes it possible for somebody to sit in that area and welcome visitors and congregation, worshippers alike. We've also worked with the ramp that was put in the 1980s to improve the overall accessibility of the area. So earlier on I mentioned the Browning Chapel, which had been converted into the Browning Room in the 20th century. It had been converted into the Browning Room, but it was often leaving a lot to be desired. The pew platform that previously existed down the far side, so there we had the Browning Chapel with the window, the same window there. When they divided it off the back of the church, the pew platform was kept as the dais for the altar, but then kept there as a meeting room, which actually became a trip hazard for anybody using that room. Also, when this wall was originally constructed, properly dividing the church from the nave from the room, although they put in a lot of effort to make it soundproofed, the heating wasn't addressed. So the heating that still existed in the Browning room was designed, in fact, to heat the whole of the back of the nave. And I'm sure there'll be some of you who remember that if it was a cold winter's day and you needed warming up, you went to the Browning room because it was often in excess of 30 degrees in there. So that needed addressing in order to have a useful meeting room where people wouldn't fall asleep because it was too warm. So bottom right, you can see that we took the opportunity to restore the stone floor, part of which still existed underneath the sheet vinyl that was added in the 1980s, and put in a rather more suitable heating system and reconfigure the room to be used as a much more high quality meeting space, which the church lets out and uses for its own functions. This room, the Crypt Hall, was reconfigured, as I mentioned, and in fact, a lot of what we did is what you can't see is in fact the reconfiguration of the ventilation, which I think is now working substantially better and serves a crowded room, and with facilities such as the screen. I won't say very much about building services. Electrics, plumbing, and ventilation, perhaps not the most interesting area of work for many people, but just to say that whenever one is carrying out a project like this, the building services can get very, very complicated indeed. Buildings are often grown, they've been altered in something of an ad hoc way, and when we started this project, we were really picking up quite a great nest of wiring and piping to establish where areas were fed from. You'd switch it, we thought you'd switch the power off, but in fact it was still on. And with the different uses in the building, it was very complicated indeed. The project took the opportunity to rationalise that, and in fact the services are now much more clearly zoned, which has practical benefits in terms of the occupant groups can be fairly monitored and charged for their energy use, but also it makes the very practical sense when trying to unpick the problems of things as and when they do go down and go wrong. So much of what we talked about is actually about the facilities of the church and what goes on in the crypt. But it would be remiss of me not to talk about the magnificent architecture of this building and a bit of what we have done also above ground to improve the nature of the church and how it can be used. Yes, we've put in the new staircase and lift, which exists in the former kitchen at the back of the nave. But a lot of the work that we've done at the upper levels has been about adapting the building, focusing on repairs, restoration, I use that word carefully after Kate's introduction, but also noting how 20th century, 21st century life and sustainability can drive adaptations with our church buildings as well. So quantifying the work and the likely expenditure prior to the scaffolding going up on the outside is always a bit of a challenge. Best served by trying to carry out good surveys in advance while one is preparing the information. And this project was no different. We were looking to undertake stone repairs and cleaning, as well as some substantial roofing work. The stonework hadn't received much attention in recent decades, and there were a number of problems emerging. In some cases, weathering and general dirt, but equally there were some corroding ironwork elements that needed to be addressed. Top left there, that's one of our structural engineers, Tom, having climbed up that steeplejack's ladder in order to be able to assess the work before we got the scaffold up. And as part of the preparation of details, sketches were prepared, scoping out the work that would eventually be translated into more detailed specifications. So we've replaced stonework, we've conserved some, we've done some cleaning, we've put in lead flashings, we've helped the building shed water better and help itself be looked after over the decades to come. With the work to the roof and the external envelope, the building, a substantial scaffolding was needed, a full temporary roof over the nave, However, in the end, we didn't scaffold the tower. We used steeple jacks to access that work. With what we were doing, it was more cost effective and worked better with the contractor's programme. After all, this building was to remain occupied and in use throughout the extensive building works. That meant that we needed very complicated and complex logistical plans as the work was moved around the building. We needed places for contractors to live effectively, store their materials, access the building, but all times actually allowing the life of this building to continue. I think one of the areas that we're actually proudest of in the building is the roof. This is what we started with a few years ago, a relatively cheap recovering roof carried out in the 1970s with sheet aluminium and concrete tiles. It had been, to be honest, fairly poorly designed, no insulation. After all, that wasn't really highest of priorities in the 1970s. But inadequate guttering that was not only reaching the end of its natural life, but also couldn't cope with the kind of climate change rainfall that we're now beginning to get. When the gutters flooded, they could leak into the building, putting the rest of the building at risk, not least of which the nave ceiling. The project provided the opportunity to study the roof in a bit more detail. We had 3D laser scans carried out of the building as part of the survey work, and these could be developed into three-dimensional drawings, so we could see exactly how it went together. And it's pretty interesting discoveries too. We haven't really talked about conservation management philosophy. That's a project or a talk for another time. But a conservation management plan had been prepared for the building. And with the discoveries that we were making as we got started on the roof, we added to the conservation management plan with additional information that was coming to light about this roof. It turns out, bottom left, Marylebone Church roof structure was published as an exemplar in the 1820s of a great example of a large span construction. It's been repaired since, but it is actually an interesting hybrid structure of a king post and a queen post roof arrangement with a substantial bottom chord, a structural member that spans fully from side to side. And we haven't actually bottomed out whether that was Baltic timber or even possibly American timber, but it probably almost certainly wasn't English or UK, because actually there wasn't that kind of size of timber available by that time. A potential area for future study. What we also discovered about the ceiling of the nave, you remember that Thomas Harris represented the interior of the church. We thought probably that ceiling was entirely replaced in the 1880s. Actually, no. A lot of the flat work that still exists today appears to be original from the first build of the church, the 1817 build. With lath and plaster, timber laths, where you run the plaster underneath, squeeze it up and flatten it off, and put your mouldings in that way. Thomas Harris kept the flatwork plaster and added the later fibrous plaster, which are cast moulded items, suspended through it in the 1880s. I'll come back to a little bit more about the work that we had to do there in a moment. But externally, we were looking to substantially refinish the roof, taking away the aluminium that covered the main part of the roof, the concrete tiles that covered the perimeter, and replacing it with a traditional slate roof with lead gutters and lead perimeter roofs. The gutters needed to be substantially redesigned, however, to manage the flow of water. These days, when we're looking at historic buildings, we get into quite a lot of technical detail about calculating the flow of water, what's likely to be the peak flow of water coming off that roof with the intensity of storms that we get today. And it's no good shedding it just off the roof. You have to be able to deal with it all the way down into the drains. And two of the downpipes either side of the tower going down to the ground also had to be increased in size from 4 inches to 6 inches, and under the church garden, some of the length of drain also replaced to ensure that the water could be fully taken away. And this is an increasingly common activity now with looking after our historic buildings to ensure that actually the water stays on the outside. Although we were looking to create a roof which was traditional in appearance, it needed to perform well to 21st century. We were insulating it and using the best practice standards of passive house construction with breathable insulation and airtightness membranes. But we also realised that we needed to ventilate in order to get rid of excess warm, moist air from within the building at particular times. Now, this building actually had been originally designed with a passive ventilation system. Next time you're in the nave, go and look underneath all the windows at the ground floor level. There's a little wooden flap that you can open. There's a little periscopic ventilator that connects to the grill on the outside. Look up above your head in the nave. There are perforated grills in the ceiling which connect through into the roof void. What there used to be was a ventilator in the middle of the apex of the roof. There's one, I think it's probably photographic evidence of it being left there. But when we got up there, we could see that the hole had been boarded over at some point in the 20th century. So we've reinstated that ventilator on the apex of the roof. It has a bit of modern technology added to it, which is a modern damper. So it's automatically controlled with temperature and humidity. So if you open the flaps in the nave on a warm day, the ventilator's open, you should get a draw of your air up through the building to give some natural ventilation. Image here shows the work underway. Roof stripped down to its bare boards under the temporary roof, and then the work underway to reconstruct the gutters. And we had some excellent craftsmen involved in doing that work. And I think you can see, those of you who've had the opportunity to get up on the roof, I hope will appreciate it's a fine piece of work. And if you do get the opportunity offered to get up on the roof, do take it, because it's wonderful. Beautifully neat slating, laid carefully, leadwork roofing and gutters, but also knowing that underlying this is actually a modern high-performance roof designed to look after the heat insulation, keep the warmth in the building when it's meant to be in the building. Nearly at the end of the talk, but just like to pause to contemplate the nave ceiling, as one might do when one looks upwards from the nave church. We found the ceiling to be in poor condition and vulnerable, and we were left with the challenge of how to access that and do the work while the church remained in use. The answer was that we constructed a special scaffolds spanning between the walls of the church, from which we could then support the scaffold and do the work above while the relay activities carried on below. It was very complicated because we had to build a scaffold to build the scaffold, and then took that out for a few months. So the bottom left was what we were left with, allowing services and school assemblies to carry on underneath. Once we got up close, you can see that there were challenges with cracking of the ceiling, delamination. We had a combination of the original flat plaster, Larkin plaster, the decorative moulded 1880s additions that went with that. But in an attempt to do some repairs in the 20th century at some point, there had been a modern plaster skim put underneath all the flat work, and actually a lot of the problems came from that separating from the original flat plaster from the 1820s or earlier. So we had to remove what was loose, stitch it all back together, almost quite literally, and then reskin it and redecorate it. All made much more easy to undertake because this was our scaffold platform on the top side of the previous photo, which gives you the easy access within a few feet of the underside of the ceiling. Within the roof void, it's a wonderful combination of periods of work, the brilliant structure, the lath and plaster ceiling with its repairs, but also access Malaysia on an original walkway down the centre and some perimeter walkways that we put in subsequently. And there we are, as you can now appreciate, the ceiling looking wonderful once again. And it's now removed to the point that you can actually can't really tell it was out there. So this brings us more or less to the end of the story of how the latest chapter in the long life of St Marylebone unfolded. You'll have seen, perhaps, if you came through the church garden, that there's still a little bit of work going on around the sacristy, and that was just to complete some things that we were not able to during the Changing Lives project. But overall, the Changing Lives project has been able to put the building, its users and occupants onto a much more steady footing to take it forward through the 21st century. Some of these changes are structural, not just the structure of the building and the fabric, but the way the building is used, such as the stair and the lift, and the crypt occupancy, opening up new ways of inhabiting it as that has changed throughout the second half of the 20th century and subsequently. But other changes are more subtle, carefully adapting the building and how it works for us, like the roof and the conservation of energy. And that's a theme that I think a lot of buildings will be taking forward over the next few decades. All a necessary part of how historic buildings are changed and adapted over time to remain relevant. If in doing so they can remain in their original uses, then it usually sets the path for more sensitive adaptations these days. Though in the case here of St Marylebone over the last few days, we can see that some of those have been radical and significant as well. Thank you. And if there are any questions?
Yes, exactly. I was going to put that. So if anyone has any questions for either Kate or Mike, please do ask.
I have some questions. Well, I've got lots of questions. First thing I want to say is I should have, of course, pointed out the beautiful work that you did as Paddington, and also the lovely June Street ceiling, and also Christchurch.
Yes.
Both wonderful projects. And there's a lot I want to say, because I found this really fascinating. This is a wonderful refurbishment, remodeling, kind of restoration. I use the word restoration, advisedly, but in the correct way, because it recognises this as a functioning community building, which serves lots of purposes of a very lively and vibrant building. We were just saying, actually, the thing that I think I share your interest in services and kind of really capturing examples. It's what makes the building work, isn't it? So it's really important. But this final question about energy efficiency, and interesting to hear you use the term passive house to kind of to discuss this. That's really going to be a big deal in the future, isn't it? Because we can't allow, when we think about conservative buildings and keeping them useful, we also have to think about their carbon impact. So how do you think that that relationship is going to go forward in the future? Because are there going to be problems, do you think, in making buildings, the carbon footprint really of keeping a building going and using the resources and materials to conserve it is itself to some extent a problem, isn't it? I don't know.
Yes, well, it creates many tensions.
Yeah.
Because on the very basic level, if one is receiving support, as a number of the projects that we talked about today have from the National Lottery, you're wanting to actually address within the capital project the running costs of the building and bring that down. So therefore organisations are looking to invest as much as possible within the main project to do this work. But then actually you're saying, well, is there a harm to the building in doing so? And I suppose I have to declare a number of interests in here because yes, I'm an architect. My practice is involved in actively pursuing methods that not just churches but other buildings can employ to reduce their energy usage, perhaps even generate energy. I'm also a trustee of the Georgian Group and chair the casework committee. So yes, the declaration of interests becomes quite interesting in some of our meetings. We as a practice were involved in putting the photovoltaic panels on King's College Chapel in Cambridge. And I think that's actually a really interesting example to take. Some of the work that we're doing, such as the restoration, in the broadest term, of the roof here, we're using traditional materials, but we're taking the opportunity to add insulation, make the building perform very well. That's very much a long-term view. I think that with a number of the approaches and methodologies that are currently being employed to reduce carbon footprint, such as electricity generation through photovoltaics, are more transitional technologies. And personally, this is a personal view, I am prepared, if they are justified in terms of the benefit they bring, to see photovoltaic panels appearing on buildings, but it's about taking the long-term view of how you do that. If you are having to substantially adapt, change, alter the structure and the roof covering while you're doing it, then that is a level of harm that actually puts it up the scale towards unacceptability, in my view. However, if you've got a project that you're very carefully designing so that these, what I would call somewhat transitional technologies, can subsequently be removed with minimal evidence. And it's a concept that we use a lot in a lot of the alterations that we make to buildings about reversibility. Then actually I think that that's an acceptable step that one can take. It's a somewhat simplistic view or example, but you take the opportunity that people had putting satellite dishes on buildings. 20, 30 years ago, they were plastered all over the place. You hardly see one now, because actually the technology has moved on. Things have shrunk, things have been made easier. I think with photovoltaic panels, sticking on that subject, it all doesn't depend on how you're going to use it. A university chapel is a much better candidate for generating electricity than, for example, a church, or indeed, potentially even a West End theatre, which is another one I'm looking at the moment, because actually the university has a high degree of use of electricity during the day. When the power is being generated, you can put it straight into the grid. You can use, well, you'll never generate enough to satisfy all the computers that are plugged in. Churches, perhaps, it's a little bit more difficult equation, and then you're needing to bring in somewhere to store the electricity until such time as paying tariffs are sorted, which they are not at the moment. In other words, you have to store your own electricity. That creates greater expense. It takes up more space in the building. I think there are a lot of methods that one needs to think about in terms of how one generates the heat, but equally one needs to think about overheating in buildings these days. With intensive heating or summer heating scenarios, one does need to think about how one shades buildings. The architecture may not lend itself to it naturally. There may be a need to use an air source heat pump and finding space for them to be incorporated. An air source heat pump can run in both directions. It can create warm air for the winter. It can also create cool air in the summer. We've got a project on a major central London building where we are looking to do just that, to manage a conservation environment. So I think there are a lot of challenges, but I would also encourage people to apply conservation management planning methodology in assessing the benefits and harms of the particular approaches that one's taking. So,
how do you speak to my students? Because that's wonderful, it's really fascinating. And I think there's very often a sense from architecture students is either you're building something sustainable, or you're working on a building in sustainable ways, or you're conserving it. But of course, that's not the case. I mean, there are all sorts of ways and technologies in the earth.
Well, yes, it's a slightly overused phrase these days, but actually greenest building is the one that already exists. It is not being substantially gutted to turn it into its next use even. So, yes. So actually, I mean, I don't get involved in whole life carbon calculations really very often, but actually, yes, the energy has already been expended on this building. If we can improve the way that it operates with rather more subtle uses, then perhaps we don't need a radical approach.
I had actually thanks to Mark for very Hampton as well, who's really revived a sad old friend. And Kate, I was told, and I don't know if this is right, that in country parishes there was quite a lot of pressure to build a parish hall in sort of late 19th, early 20th century, from regular parishioners who wanted to get non-church business out of the church, and from increasing numbers of non-churchgoers who also wanted to get non-church out of the church. So does that sound likely to you?
Well, I don't know very much about rural parish churches, it's not my field at all, but that's really fascinating. Obviously, that's related to shifts in worship practices and so on in the 19th century, and people starting to feel less included in worship practices and the rise of secularism, I suppose. So, yeah, I don't know very much about it, but it does sound like it. It's really interesting. Thanks for pointing that out.
Just going off that, I grew up in a rural village, and we have a church. I don't know the history of when the village hall was built, but the village hall, interestingly, is directly opposite the church, and it's also built right behind or next to the kind of one of the graveyards that is there as well. So it made me think that it's quite interesting that maybe that's why they chose to build it there, that it is connected to the church, but also providing that extra space.
Definitely. I mean, I think that the church in a rural community serves so many more functions, and it's also just symbolically where people come together, even if people aren't doing that, in terms of worship, it does kind of feel like the heart of the village, doesn't it? The heart of the community, and so it makes sense to build a village hall next to it, adjacent to it, where people can really come together. So yeah.
Can I just say, as a frequent attendee at the church over a long period, I appreciate all the things that you've done to make the church work better now, particularly access that dreadful staircase, the place with the very elegant staircase, etc. But it does this, what I'm really grateful for is it does essentially feel like the same place. Really, it feels like coming home, and it doesn't detract, things you've done don't detract from what is essentially this church. So thank you for that. But what I wanted to ask is, when you're doing this work, you sort of come head to head, don't you, with the original builders and architects?
Oh, yes.
And I get a sense when you're talking that you thought this chap did quite well, that this was quite a well-built church.
Oh, yes. Yes. I mean, yes, it was. I mean, if we leave aside the penny pinching of the reconfiguration of the main ceiling, perhaps,
Yes.
although that clearly lasted a long
wasn't
time.
him, that was
No, but I think, yes, Hardwick. Yes, Hardwick, I've worked on a couple of his buildings now, and they're generally fairly robustly built and stand the test of time. So, in fact, actually, right at the very beginning, the National Maritime Museum project that I worked on, the southwest wing that we converted into now the archive and part of the back of the Sandy Offer wing was in fact a Hardwick building. So yes, I mean, I think sometimes you get into really quite complicated arguments when you're looking for consent to be granted, where you're trying to put yourself in the mindset of the original architect to understand, if they had had the technology today, would they have used these materials? would they have put a lift in? I mean, of course they would have done. They might not have done it quite as we've done it, but yes, it's an interesting discussion. And in fact, the work that's done in putting the conservation management plan together can help a lot in that thought process, because actually it starts to tell you, it means that actually projects start with a reasonably good understanding of the development of the building, but also perhaps of the architect who designed it as well.
Can I ask you to say a little bit about stained glass in relation to conservation and carbon footprint, and how you manage the preservation and proper care of stained glass, given that it's going to be a big source of
Yes,
loss?
it's quite a tricky one, and there aren't sort of perfect answers to that. Interestingly, often what we do see increasingly is where historic glass is particularly vulnerable and deteriorating. One can do something that is called, or sometimes called isothermal glazing. So in fact, you put another layer of glass on the outside,
Subframe.
generally following the leaded pattern of it, so you still get the same impression. In fact, stand at a distance, you can't tell. But that doesn't really deal with, it makes a slightly less leaky stained glass window, but it doesn't deal with the heat losses that you tend to get. So there isn't an easy answer. Secondary glazing starts to alter the character quite considerably, because you've got a flat plane of modern glass, whether it's inside or outside, and you don't really want to change the environment in which valuable historic glass existed.
That for the stained glass.
Yes.
So there's a real tension, isn't there,
Yes.
between carbon footprint and conservation
Yes.
going on there?
Yes. I mean, I think that one looks to do what you can. I mean, I think roof areas in churches are often good opportunities for putting insulation in. So, it's about relative heat losses. In what we did here with the draft lobbies, so each of these openings in the building now has a proper draft lobby. That, I'm sure, substantially helps with the heat retention in the building. So,
And the noise.
yes, that's good to hear. So I think you just have to look at all your tools available.
Pick the least worst option.
Yes, indeed. Yes, because there are some things that are more difficult to address at the moment.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
Great, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for